Hey everyone, welcome back to CreepyCorner Stories. You know, diving into the dark web is always risky, but sharing these stories with you makes it worth it. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments below. I've noticed that these kinds of stories hit differently depending on where you are. It might even make the experience a little creepier. So, tell me, are you watching from the safety of your home or somewhere less secure? I bought a map from the dark web that shows underground cities in the US. One of the entrances is near my house. Alright, before I even get into this, I need to say that I'm not proud of where this all started. I know the moment I tell you why I was even on the dark web, you're going to roll your eyes or think I'm lying. But I swear to you, this is all true. Every word. So, about 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in my room late at night. It was one of those weird nights where you just can't sleep, and the TikTok rabbit hole wasn't doing it for me. I think I started Googling stuff like weird things found on the dark web because I'd just watched some YouTube video about cursed eBay items. You know, classic 2 AM brain rot. Anyway, after like 20 minutes of browsing Reddit threads and clicking around, I found a comment that caught my attention. Maps that shouldn't exist. Check XYZ Marketplace if you want your mind blown. Now, I'd been on the dark web once before. Nothing crazy. I just wanted to see if it was as shady as people said. Spoiler, it is. But this felt different. I wasn't looking for drugs or hitmen or anything like that. I just wanted to see what they meant by maps that shouldn't exist. I mean, how bad could it be? So, I got my VPN up, accessed Tor, and found the marketplace they mentioned. Most of it was what you'd expect. Stolen credit card info, counterfeit passports, all the gross stuff I won't get into here. But then I found the listing. Secret underground cities of the United States. Full map with entrances. The description was vague. It talked about government cover-ups, forgotten tunnels, and unexplored settlements deep beneath the earth. The seller had a sketchy username, something like Blackhand23, and their profile picture was just a blacked out silhouette. It was all so cliché, but I couldn't stop myself. The listing said the map was authentic, and that it showed the locations of entrances to these underground cities, places that, apparently, were supposed to be abandoned, but weren't. I should have clicked out right there. But no. Curiosity got the best of me. It was $25 in Bitcoin, and I thought, what's the harm? The transaction went through instantly. A download link popped up, and within seconds, I had the map on my computer. At first, I thought it was a joke. The map itself was just an old-school PDF scan, like something ripped out of an atlas from the 1950s. But the more I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just a map of the US. It had detailed markings in certain states. Most of the entrances were scattered across the Midwest, but there were some in weirder spots too. Los Angeles, Portland, Denver. Each location had a small note scribbled next to it, in red ink. Stuff like restricted, monitored, high activity, and never go alone. That should have been enough to delete the whole thing and go to bed, but one note hit way too close to home. About 30 miles outside my city, in the middle of this forest preserve, there was an entrance marked. The note next to it read, "Active, recently disturbed." I didn't sleep much the night after I downloaded the map. I kept replaying the same thoughts over and over. What if it's real? What if there's actually something out there? I kept looking at the red ink note. Active, recently disturbed. I tried to brush it off as some dumb joke or the ramblings of a conspiracy nut, but it stuck with me like an itch I couldn't scratch. The forest preserve marked on the map wasn't some far-off, unknown place. It was local, like really local. I'd been there before, but I'd never thought twice about it. Just a bunch of woods and trails, nothing special. But the idea that something was hidden there, buried right under my nose, kept me from brushing it off. The next day, I told myself I wasn't going to do anything stupid. I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't some dumb teenager out looking for thrills. But the map, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept imagining that clearing, that marked spot. What was recently disturbed? Was someone digging something up, burying something? By the time the sun went down, my curiosity had won. I got to the parking lot of the preserve around noon the next day. I brought my flashlight, my phone, a water bottle, and, as dumb as it sounds, my old pocket knife. Not that I thought I'd actually need it, but holding it made me feel better, even if it was just some false sense of security. The parking lot was empty, which was strange. Normally, you'd see at least a car or two, maybe some families walking their dogs, or college kids taking pictures for Instagram. But today, there was nothing. No cars, no people. Just my beat-up Honda and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The place was too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves. Just this weird, low hum of silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. I've been to this preserve plenty of times before, but I don't ever remember it feeling like that. I almost turned back. My gut was screaming at me to just get in my car and go home. But that stupid note, recently disturbed, kept tugging at me. I needed to see it for myself. The trail to the clearing wasn't hard to find. It's a short hike, maybe 10 or 15 minutes if you're not rushing, but it felt longer this time. Every step felt heavier, like I was walking into something I wasn't supposed to see. The deeper I went, the worse it got. I started noticing little things I hadn't seen before. A tree with its bark peeled clean off, like something had clawed at it. A discarded shoe, half buried in the dirt. At first, I thought it was just trash, but it wasn't old. The rubber was still white. The laces weren't frayed. Someone had left it there, recently. I wanted to turn back. I should have turned back, but I kept going. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was wrong. The clearing wasn't how I remembered it. The last time I'd been here, it was just a wide open space, a patch of grass surrounded by trees. But now it looked like something had torn it apart. The grass was flattened in places, like someone, or something, had been dragging heavy machinery through it. There were patches of dirt dug up everywhere, deep holes like the kind you see when someone's installing pipes or wires. And in the middle of it all, there was this opening. It was hard to see at first because it was partially covered by branches and leaves. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't just some natural cave or hollow. It was man-made. The entrance was wide, maybe 10 feet across, and lined with jagged concrete that looked like it had been blasted apart. I didn't want to get closer. I really didn't. But my feet kept moving. The smell hit me before I even got to the edge of the hole. It was sharp and metallic, like rusted pipes. But underneath that, there was something else. Something sour, like rotting meat that had been left out in the sun for days. I gagged and pulled my hoodie up over my nose, but it didn't help. The The closer I got, the stronger it became. My hands were shaking as I shined my flashlight into the opening. The tunnel went down at a steep angle, the walls made of cracked, uneven brick that looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The ground was littered with debris, chunks of concrete, scraps of metal, and bones. Yes, bones. They were scattered everywhere, like someone had just dumped them there and left. Some were small, probably animal bones, but others looked wrong. Too big, too thick. I didn't want to think about what they might have belonged to. There were symbols carved into the brick walls, too. Weird, jagged shapes that looked almost like letters, but weren't any language I'd ever seen. Some of them were smeared with what looked like dried blood, the dark stains crusted over and flaking off in places. And then there was the sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe air whistling through the tunnel, but it wasn't. It was this low, rhythmic hum, almost like a chant, but it was too faint to make out the words. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. I should have run. I should have turned around, gotten back in my car, and driven as far away as possible. But I didn't. I took a step closer. There was something down there. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. This overwhelming sense of presence, like I was being watched. My flashlight flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to make my heart stop. When the light came back on, I saw it. A handprint. It was smeared on the brick wall, long and thin, with fingers that stretched way too far to be human. The edges were jagged, like whoever or whatever had left it had claws instead of nails. The blood was fresh, still wet. That was it. That was my limit. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the undergrowth and nearly tripping over my own feet. The whole way back, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, or feel something grab me, but there was nothing. Just that suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. When I finally made it back to my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything had followed me. I didn't leave my house for 2 days after I found the tunnel. I locked every door and window, triple-checked them every few hours. I even left the lights on in every room, which didn't do much except make me feel slightly less insane. I tried convincing myself that it was just some kind of prank, or maybe an old fallout shelter that had been abandoned and vandalized over the years. The handprint, the fresh one, was harder to explain, but I told myself it was probably just some idiot playing games. But then there were the bones, and the smell, and the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me the entire time I was in that clearing. I couldn't shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tunnel, that gaping black hole, the blood-smeared symbols, the handprint. It got worse at night. I'd be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I'd swear I could hear something. Faint, distant, but there. A low hum, like the one I'd heard in the tunnel. I tried blasting music to drown it out, but it didn't help. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my head. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I couldn't live with this hanging over me. I knew it was stupid, so stupid, but I had to go back. I had to see what was down there. I packed a backpack with some basic supplies, a flashlight, extra batteries, my pocket knife, water, and a crowbar I had lying around in my garage. I also brought a cheap GoPro I'd bought years ago for a camping trip. I figured if I didn't make it back, maybe someone would find the footage and know what happened to me. I left just after sunset. Driving to the preserve at night was a completely different experience. The roads were empty, no streetlights for miles, just endless darkness, the occasional flicker of my high beams catching the reflection of an animal's eyes in the trees. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was just as empty as before. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of every sound your body makes. The crunch of gravel under my boots felt too loud as I stepped out of the car. Walking through the woods at night was a mistake. The trail, which had felt eerily quiet during the day, was now downright oppressive. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows longer and deeper. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I reached the clearing faster than I thought I would. My feet felt like they were moving on autopilot, like my body knew the way even if my brain was screaming at me to turn around. The clearing looked the same, but worse. The flattened grass had been torn up even more, the holes in the ground wider and deeper. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut, stronger than before, almost unbearable. I gagged, pulling my hoodie up over my nose again, but it didn't help. The tunnel was still there, yawning open like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. The branches and leaves that had partially covered it were gone, like someone, or something, had cleared the way. The concrete edges of the opening looked darker, stained with something wet. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the blackness, my flashlight beam barely piercing the void. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't. The descent was slow, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder the further I went, thick and damp, like a basement that had been sealed off for decades. The walls were slick with moisture, the bricks crumbling in places. The hum was back. It was faint at first, just a low vibration I could feel in my chest. But as I moved deeper into the tunnel, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a hum, it was a voice. No, not a single voice. Voices. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, echoing off the walls, whispering, murmuring, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. They weren't speaking English, or any language I'd ever heard. It was guttural, harsh, like the sound of grinding metal mixed with animal growls. About 50 feet in, I saw the first sign of life. There was something on the ground, half buried in the dirt and rubble. At first, I thought it was a bundle of rags, but when I got closer, I realized it was clothing, a torn hoodie and a pair of jeans, caked in mud and blood. The blood was fresh. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I didn't want to touch it, but my brain couldn't stop analyzing it. The way the hoodie was torn, the jagged edges of the fabric, it wasn't normal. It looked like it had been shredded by claws. Next to the clothes was a shoe. Not a pair, just one. A black sneaker, smeared with blood and dirt, the sole bent at an unnatural angle. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to keep going. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, and that's where I saw it. The first thing I noticed was the table. It was massive, carved out of stone, and covered in symbols like the ones I'd seen at the entrance. But these were different, more detailed, more intricate. Some of them were filled with what looked like dried blood, the grooves caked with it, like it had been poured into the carvings. Around the table were chairs, Thrones, really, also carved from stone. There were 5 of them, arranged in a semicircle, each one facing the table. But the worst part, there was someone sitting in one of the chairs. At least, I think it was someone. The figure was slumped forward, its head resting against the table, arms limp at its sides. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over its bones, like it had been dead for weeks. But it didn't smell like decay. It smelled like iron, like blood. And then it moved. Just a twitch, barely noticeable, but enough to send me stumbling back, my flashlight beam jerking across the walls. The figure's head lifted slowly, too slowly, and when it turned to face me, I dropped the flashlight. Its eyes were gone. Just hollow sockets, dark and empty, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. And then it smiled. It didn't have lips, just rows of jagged yellow teeth that glistened in the dim light. The sound it made wasn't a laugh, but it was close. A wet, rattling noise that sent a wave of nausea through me. I scrambled to pick up my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When I shined the beam back on the figure, it was standing, and it wasn't alone. The other chairs were no longer empty. 5 figures, all of them standing now, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They moved in unison, slow and deliberate, stepping away from the table and toward me. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. My legs were moving before my brain even processed what was happening. I didn't think. I just reacted. The beam of my flashlight swung wildly in front of me, the shadows on the tunnel walls twisting and bending like something alive. The low, wet sound those things made, half growl, half laugh, followed me, bouncing off the brick walls, getting louder with every second. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I'd freeze. And if I froze, I knew I'd never leave that tunnel. My breath came in sharp, burning gasps as my boots slammed against the dirt floor. The air felt thicker now, almost alive, wrapping around me, like invisible hands trying to slow me down. My flashlight flickered again, the light dimming just enough to make me want to scream. The tunnel felt longer. I swear it hadn't taken me this much time to get in. Every step forward felt like I was moving deeper instead of closer to the exit, like the walls were stretching, dragging me back toward that chamber. But the worst part, the sounds behind me were getting closer. At first, it was just the steady scrape of feet or claws dragging against the dirt. But soon, it changed. The sounds became faster, more frantic, almost erratic, like whatever was back there wasn't walking anymore. It was running. I don't know how to describe the way it sounded, but it wasn't like a person. The footsteps came too fast, like there were too many legs hitting the ground at once. And underneath it, I could hear that wet, rattling noise, the same one the figure in the chair had made, but louder, more guttural. I stumbled over a loose brick, nearly falling face first into the ground. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and rolling away. The darkness swallowed me for a second, and I thought, this is it. I'm done. But adrenaline is a hell of a thing. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, clawing for the flashlight, my fingers brushing over dirt and rock until I felt the cold metal. When the beam came back on, I almost wished it hadn't. The light caught one of them, no more than 15 feet behind me. It was crawling on all fours, its limbs twisted and too long, the joints bending the wrong way. Its skin looked wrong, stretched too tight and covered in something shiny, like it was wet. And its face, God, its face. It didn't have eyes. Just empty sockets that oozed something thick and black, dripping down its face in slow, viscous trails. Its mouth was too wide. The corners stretched past where its jaw should have ended. And the teeth, they weren't human. They were jagged and uneven, like shards of broken glass, stained dark with whatever it had been eating. It let out this horrible, choking sound, like it was trying to speak, but couldn't form the words. Then it lunged. I screamed, bolting to my feet and running faster than I thought was possible. I didn't even care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out. The hum in the air had turned into a roar now, like dozens of voices were screaming at once. My head was pounding, my vision blurring, but I kept moving. The tunnel started to change. The walls, which had been made of crumbling brick, were now jagged and raw, like they'd been ripped apart by something huge. Roots dangled from the ceiling, some of them so low that I had to duck to avoid them. And then I saw the markings. At first, I thought they were just more of the symbols I'd seen before, but they weren't. These were bigger, carved deep into the walls. I was in my living room, trying to distract myself by watching something, anything, on Netflix. The TV wasn't helping. Every time I tried to focus on the screen, my eyes would drift towards the windows, toward the darkness just beyond the thin curtains. It was around 11 p.m. when the power went out. No warning, no flicker, just gone. The TV shut off, plunging the room into silence so heavy I felt it in my chest. I froze, sitting perfectly still on the couch, my phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. The only light in the house came from the weak glow of the screen, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. That's when I heard it, the sound of something tapping on the glass. Not a knock, a tap, gentle, deliberate, rhythmic. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The window was to my right, the curtains drawn, but I didn't need to pull them back to know what was on the other side. The tapping stopped, and then I heard footsteps, not inside the house, outside, circling the perimeter. Slow, heavy, deliberate, like they wanted me to hear them. My stomach twisted, and I grabbed the knife I'd left on the coffee table. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold it, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped at the front door, and then they knocked. It wasn't normal knocking. It wasn't frantic, or polite, or hesitant. It was wrong. 3 hard knocks, perfectly spaced, followed by silence so deep I could hear my own breathing. I didn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the voice. It was low and guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. I couldn't understand the words. It didn't sound like a language I'd ever heard, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, playful, and it was coming from right outside the door. I don't remember making the decision to move. 1 second, I was frozen on the couch, and the next, I was stumbling toward the back door, clutching the knife like it would actually protect me. My phone flashlight shook as I moved, the beam bouncing off the walls, creating shadows that made my stomach lurch. The whispers were louder now, following me through the house. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the walls. As I reached the back door, I heard something behind me. A low scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. My heart dropped, and I turned around, my phone shaking in my hand. The hallway behind me was empty, but the sound didn't stop. It was coming closer, louder now, like whatever was making it wanted me to know it was there. I backed up against the door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers slipping as I tried to twist it open. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the weak light of my flashlight, was a figure. It was standing completely still, its head tilted to the side in that same unnatural way, like it was studying me. Its limbs were too long, its fingers brushing the floor, the claws clicking softly against the wood. And its face. It didn't have one. Just smooth, featureless flesh, where its eyes and mouth should have been. But it was smiling, not with a mouth, but with its entire body. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it smiling, feel the amusement radiating off of it, as if it was enjoying my panic. The lock finally gave way, and I threw the door open, stumbling out into the backyard. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran. The street was empty, eerily quiet, every house dark. My neighbor's porch lights, usually left on all night, were off. Even the street lights weren't working, the entire neighborhood swallowed by darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. My flashlight flickered, the weak beam barely cutting through the black, and I could still hear the whispers. They were louder now, no longer faint or distant, but right in my ear, overlapping voices that didn't belong to anyone I'd ever known. "Why are you running?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't in my head this time. They were real, spoken aloud, coming from behind me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and turned around slowly. They were there, all 5 of them, standing in a loose circle around me, their twisted bodies illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. They didn't move, but I could feel them closing in, their hollow eyes locked onto me, their 2 wide grins splitting their faces. One of them stepped forward, its head tilting as it reached out with a long, skeletal hand. Its claws gleamed in the faint light, dripping with something dark and wet. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the pavement. The flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling away and plunging me into total darkness. And that's when I heard it. Not the whispers, not the footsteps. Laughter, deep, guttural laughter, echoing all around me, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it wildly in every direction. They were gone. The street was empty. I don't know how I made it back home. I don't remember running or opening the door or locking it behind me. But somehow, I ended up in my bedroom, sitting on the floor with my back pressed against the wall, the knife clutched in my shaking hands. The whispers haven't stopped. They're louder now, filling every corner of the house. And the hum, it's everywhere. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't think. I know they're coming for me. And the worst part, I don't think they're going to kill me. I think they're going to take me back to that tunnel, back to whatever is waiting down there. And I think I'm going to let them, because the whispers, they're starting to make sense, and they're telling me things I don't want to hear. I watched a dark web live stream of a secret space mission. The rocket. They launched, came back with passengers that weren't astronauts. This all started because I was bored and scrolling Reddit late at night. You know how it is. Deep dives into random subreddits you'd never admit to browsing during the day. It was around 1 a.m. when I stumbled on a post in r/unresolved jump mysteries with the title, "SpaceX isn't the only one sending rockets into space." I was intrigued, but not surprised. Half the time, posts like that are just weird conspiracy theories, right? Aliens, black budget projects, secret governments, Same old recycled stuff. But there was this one comment that stood out, buried under a pile of deleted replies. It simply read, "If you're really curious, check this out. Redacted link. It'll blow your mind." Normally, I wouldn't touch a link like that. I mean, this wasn't exactly YouTube or TikTok territory. It looked shady as hell, but something about the way it was phrased, almost casual, felt like bait I couldn't resist. Besides, I had my old gaming laptop, so if it nuked anything, it wasn't a huge loss. I downloaded Tor and pasted the link. What popped up wasn't what I expected. No weird ads or sketchy sites selling fake IDs. Instead, the page was minimalist, sleek, and had one main feature, a large countdown timer with bold letters above it that read, "Watch the future, live space mission, January 5th. The date was today. The timer showed less than 2 hours until launch. At first, I thought it was a prank, someone repurposing old NASA footage or something. But the design looked too polished. No branding, no ads, no fluff. Just a single button at the bottom of the screen that said, "Join stream." I hesitated. There was no chat, no sign-up page, no payment request. But there was also no way to see who was hosting it. Everything about the setup was screaming at me to close the tab and forget I ever saw it. But curiosity won. I clicked. The stream loaded instantly, and I swear, my heart skipped a beat. The quality was insane, easily 4K. The video showed a massive rocket on a dimly lit launch pad. It wasn't SpaceX or NASA. There were no logos or identifying marks. The rocket itself was sleek, black, and way more advanced looking than anything I'd ever seen. A timestamp in the corner confirmed it was live. I glanced at the viewer count, 11,289. It climbed steadily, 12,000, 15,000. The camera angles were professional, like a Hollywood production. First, a wide shot of the rocket towering under the night sky. Then a close-up of its exterior, where I noticed something strange. The whole thing seemed too clean. No scratches, no bolts, no seams. Just this flawless, unbroken surface. That's when I realized there was no chatter, no mission control, no countdown, no buzzing background of voices like you'd hear during a NASA launch. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the camera feed switched to a cockpit view, or at least what should have been a cockpit. There was no one inside. At first, I thought I must have missed something. Maybe this was a fully automated mission. But even unmanned rockets usually have some kind of monitoring equipment. This one was completely empty, just a cold, sterile interior that looked more like the inside of an iPhone than a spacecraft. The walls had a weird metallic sheen that seemed to ripple faintly, almost like liquid. The camera cut back to the exterior as the countdown reached 0. A low rumble filled my headphones as the engines roared to life. The rocket lifted off smoothly, flames billowing as it ascended into the sky. I was mesmerized. The earth shrank rapidly beneath it, the colors fading into blackness. The feed switched to an onboard camera, showing the curve of the planet against the vast emptiness of space. I couldn't help but feel a chill. It was beautiful, sure, but also lonely, empty. That's when things got weird. About 10 minutes into the flight, the camera feed glitched. It was brief, maybe half a second, but enough to notice. When it came back, something had changed. The rocket's exterior, which had been pristine at launch, now looked damaged. The once smooth surface was scorched, as if it had been through re-entry. Except that didn't make sense. It had just launched. Before I could process that, the camera glitched again. This time, the feed didn't come back right away. The screen went black, and all I could hear was a faint humming sound, like static. I stared at the screen, waiting, my heart pounding. Then finally, the video returned, but the view wasn't the same. The onboard camera was still showing the interior of the rocket, only now, it wasn't empty. There was someone, or something, inside. It stood in the middle of the cockpit, motionless. Its outline was humanoid, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its skin, or what I think was skin, was pale and almost translucent, like frosted glass. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if it could see me watching. My stomach dropped. Then, for the first time, a voice crackled through the audio feed. It wasn't robotic or human. It was layered, like multiple people speaking in unison. It said 3 words that I'll never forget. We are here. The moment the voice said, "We are here," my body locked up like someone had poured ice water into my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just sat there staring at the screen like a complete idiot. The thing in the cockpit didn't move either. It just stood there, its smooth, featureless head tilted ever so slightly, as if it was trying to decide what to do next. The stream was still live, confirmed by the numbers ticking up in the corner. Over 60,000 people were watching now, but there was no chat, no comments, no way to tell what anyone else was thinking. It was just me, and whatever the hell that thing was, locked in this silent, horrifying moment. Then, slowly, the camera started to pan. At first, I thought maybe the feed had glitched again, but no, it was deliberate. The onboard camera shifted, revealing more of the interior, and that's when I realized it wasn't just one of them. There were others. They were lined up against the walls of the cockpit, perfectly still. 5, 6, no, 7 of them, all identical to the first. Same impossibly thin frames, same pale glassy skin that shimmered faintly under the harsh cockpit lights. None of them had faces, but somehow I could feel them watching, not just looking at the camera, watching me. And they weren't just standing there. They were holding things. One of them clutched what looked like a metallic cylinder, almost like a thermos, but with strange glowing symbols etched into its surface. Another held something I can only describe as a twisted, charred piece of metal. At first, I thought it was debris, maybe from the rocket, but then I noticed it had a distinct shape, something that looked disturbingly like the remains of a human ribcage. The rest of them held other objects, equally bizarre. A bundle of wires, a jagged shard of glass, something that might have been a melted helmet. Each item looked like it had been scavenged from somewhere no human should have been. And then I saw the last one. It was holding what I thought was a mannequin at first, a human-sized figure, limp and lifeless. But as the camera zoomed in, I realized it wasn't plastic. It was flesh. The thing was holding a person. The body was charred beyond recognition, the skin blackened and peeling. Parts of it were missing. The left arm ended in a jagged stump, and the face, oh God, the face, was barely there. Just an empty, gaping hole where the mouth should have been. The eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. I had to look away. My stomach churned, and I thought I was going to throw up right there on my keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to close the stream. Some sick, twisted part of me needed to see what would happen next. The thing holding the body tilted its head, just like the first one had. Then it lifted the corpse, almost tenderly, and pressed its featureless face against what was left of the human's head. A new sound crackled through the feed. At first, I thought it was static, but then I realized it was a voice. Help. The word was faint, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of panic through me. The voice wasn't coming from the camera's audio, it was coming from the body. Please, help. The thing pulled back, still cradling the corpse like it was some kind of grotesque doll. And then slowly, it turned its head to the camera. My hands were shaking so badly that I accidentally hit my mouse, almost closing the stream. But when I steadied the screen, something new had appeared. A message. It wasn't on the video itself, but overlaid on the webpage like a notification. It was a single sentence in bold white text. Do not look away. I froze. The feed zoomed out slightly, showing the entire cockpit again. The humanoid things were still standing there, perfectly still. The one holding the body had stepped forward, closer to the camera. The others remained against the walls, unmoving. The message flashed again. Do not look away. I didn't dare blink. I didn't even know if it was a warning or a threat, but something deep inside me screamed that if I looked away, something worse would happen. Then, one of the things on the wall moved. It was subtle, just a twitch of its long, bony arm, but it was enough to make my heart jump. Slowly, it turned its head toward the camera, and then, one by one, the others started to move, their heads snapping to face the lens. That's when the stream cut to black. For a second, I thought the feed had gone offline, but then the black screen was replaced by a new image, a live view of the rocket from the ground. It was descending. The sleek black surface of the rocket was scorched and battered, as if it had been through hell and back. Flames licked the edges of the screen as the craft hurtled toward the earth, way too fast for a controlled landing. But that wasn't the worst part. The onboard camera feed reappeared, showing the cockpit again. The humanoid things were gone. The room was empty, save for one thing. The charred body, now sitting upright in one of the chairs. Its head lolled to the side, and its empty, gaping eye sockets stared directly into the camera. The rocket was getting closer to the ground. I could see the outlines of a city below. Streetlights, highways, and tiny clusters of buildings. And then, just before impact, the screen froze. The final image burned into my brain was the corpse, grinning. Not just smiling, grinning. A jagged, impossibly wide smile, like its skin had been torn open to make the expression. Then the stream ended. I sat there in the dark, staring at my laptop, the silence almost unbearable. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it real? A prank? Some kind of insane viral marketing stunt? But then my phone buzzed. It was a text, an unknown number. You looked away. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I just sat there in the glow of my laptop, replaying everything over and over in my head. The stream, the rocket, the things inside it, and that final, grotesque image of the grinning corpse. And then there was the text message. You looked away. It was still on my phone, sitting there like a bomb I didn't know how to defuse. The number was completely untraceable, just a string of random digits that made no sense. I tried calling it, but the line didn't even ring. It just cut to dead air, like the number didn't exist. For a while, I convinced myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me. But deep down, I knew better. Someone, something, knew I had watched that stream, and they were watching me back. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I went to Starbucks, hoping caffeine might drown out the buzzing anxiety in my head. As I waited for my latte, I scrolled Twitter on my phone, desperate for something mundane to distract me. That's when I saw it. It was trending under a hashtag, #rocket crash. My heart sank. I clicked it, and sure enough, there it was. Footage of the rocket crash. Dozens of angles, all from different people who had filmed it on their phones. The rocket had come down just outside a city in New Mexico, near some abandoned industrial park. The video showed a massive fireball lighting up the night sky as the rocket slammed into the ground. But here's the thing. No one seemed to know whose rocket it was. The news articles I found were all the same. Speculation with no answers. It wasn't NASA, it wasn't SpaceX, and no private company was taking responsibility. The government hadn't released any statements either, just silence. And then there were the rumors. People on Twitter were claiming they'd seen figures emerging from the wreckage before the fire crews arrived. Others said they heard strange noises, screeching, guttural sounds that didn't belong to any human or animal. One post in particular made my stomach churn. It was a blurry photo, supposedly taken by someone who snuck past the police barricade. It showed the edge of the crash site, where something long and thin was sprawled on the ground. The caption read, "What the hell is this?" I didn't need to squint to know what it was. Even through the grainy pixels, I recognized the shimmering, translucent skin of one of those things from the stream. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I even slid my dresser in front of my bedroom door, just to feel like I had some semblance of control. But I couldn't stop checking my phone. Every notification made me jump. Every time the screen lit up, I half expected to see another text from that number. I thought about blocking it, but some part of me was scared too, like ignoring it might make things worse. Then, around midnight, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a notification from an unknown app I'd never downloaded. The icon was a simple black square, no name, just an alert that read, "Livestream in progress." My breath caught. I stared at the notification, my finger hovering over it, torn between terror and morbid curiosity. Finally, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I tapped it. The screen went black for a moment before the stream loaded. It wasn't the rocket this time. It was my apartment. The camera was positioned just outside my building, facing my window. I could see the faint glow of my TV through the curtains and the silhouette of my shadow as I paced back and forth. I froze, my brain short-circuiting. Someone, or something, was here, watching me. The camera feed zoomed in, the resolution so sharp I could see the condensation on my window. Then the view shifted, panning slowly to the left. It stopped on a figure standing across the street. It was one of them. The same impossibly tall, thin frame. The same translucent skin that seemed to shimmer under the streetlights. It was completely still, except for its head, which tilted ever so slightly toward the camera, toward me. I backed away from the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. But the stream wasn't done. The camera started to move again, this time toward the figure. The view bobbed slightly, like it was being carried by someone walking, but there was no one holding it. The camera just floated forward, closing the distance between itself and the thing across the street. And then, without warning, the figure snapped its head to face the lens. Its featureless face was inches from the camera now, staring directly into it. Into me. That's when the stream cut out, leaving only a single line of text on the screen. "You can't run." I threw my phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, the screen shattering on impact. But I didn't care. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and ran out the door without even putting on shoes. The hallway of my building was eerily quiet. I half expected to see one of those things waiting for me at the end, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was out of breath and on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. My car was parked under a flickering streetlight, the shadows dancing like they were alive. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like metal scraping against concrete. It came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and floored it out of there. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something impossibly tall, with limbs that bent the wrong way. I haven't been back to my apartment since. That was 3 days ago. I've been driving aimlessly ever since, stopping only at crowded places where I feel less alone. Walmarts, McDonald's, 24-hour diners, anywhere with bright lights and security cameras. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. This morning, I woke up in my car outside a gas station. My phone, the one I'd smashed, was sitting on the passenger seat, completely intact. There was a new message on the screen. "They're coming." I stared at the message on my phone, my mind blank with terror. "They're coming." Simple. Director. Impossible to misunderstand. I checked the phone again. It was the same one I had smashed 3 nights ago, down to the crack I'd put in the corner when it hit the wall. But now, the screen was flawless, like nothing had ever happened. Every instinct told me to get back on the road, to keep moving. But I hesitated, glancing at the gas station. The bright fluorescent lights felt like a barrier against the darkness pressing in from all sides. There was a cashier inside, a tired-looking guy, probably in his 20s, slouched over his phone. I decided to go in. The moment I walked through the door, I felt exposed. The fluorescent lights were harsh, buzzing faintly above me, but they did little to ease the gnawing anxiety in my chest. I grabbed a couple of random snacks, mostly to give myself an excuse to linger. The cashier barely looked up as I approached the counter. His name tag read, Eddie. "You okay?" he asked, his voice flat. I must have looked like hell. My hair was a mess, my clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the car, and I hadn't shaved in days. "Yeah," I lied. "Just passing through." He rang me up, but his eyes kept flicking to the window behind me. I didn't notice at first, but when he froze mid-scan, I turned to look. Something was moving in the shadows just outside the edge of the parking lot. "Did you see that?" Eddie whispered. I swallowed hard. "See what?" He shook his head, laughing nervously. "I don't know, man. Thought I saw something. Maybe a deer or something big. But we both knew it wasn't a deer." I paid for my snacks and hurried back to my car. As I climbed in, I noticed the lights in the gas station flickering. Eddie was standing at the window now, watching me with a strange, tight-lipped expression. I almost rolled down my window to ask him what was wrong, but before I could, the power cut out completely. The parking lot was plunged into darkness. For a moment, the world was silent. No buzzing lights, no hum of electricity, just the quiet creak of my car as I shifted in my seat. My headlights were the only source of illumination, casting long, eerie shadows across the lot. And then I saw them. Figures. Not one, not two, but at least 10 of them, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. They were perfectly still, their translucent skin glowing faintly in the dark. One of them took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate, and completely soundless. Its long, spindly limbs moved like a puppet on invisible strings. My hands fumbled for the keys. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The figures didn't flinch. They just kept coming, their movements synchronized, like they were part of some horrifying dance. I threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as I backed out of the lot. For a split second, my headlights caught Eddie through the gas station window. He wasn't watching me anymore. He was staring at the figures, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then, the glass shattered. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and endless, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something lurking in the back seat. The shadows outside seemed to move with me, flickering just out of sight. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into an empty parking lot outside a 24-hour diner. My stomach churned at the thought of food, but I couldn't keep driving without a break. The diner was the kind of place you see in old movies, neon lights buzzing weakly, peeling vinyl booths, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working there for 30 years. The smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air. I sat in a booth near the back, my back to the wall, so I could see the entrance. The waitress poured me a cup of coffee without asking. "Rough night?" she said, her voice gravelly. "You could say that." She nodded like she'd heard it all before. "Middle of nowhere brings out the weirdos. You need anything, just holler." As she walked away, I noticed something scrawled on the napkin she'd left. It wasn't a note. It was a symbol, a circle, with 3 jagged lines cutting through it. The same symbol I'd seen etched into the glowing cylinder one of the figures was holding. I bolted up, knocking over the coffee. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaking. The waitress didn't respond. She was gone. The diner was empty. The lights began to flicker. I backed toward the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for my car. But as I stepped outside, I froze. There was a figure standing next to my car. It wasn't like the ones I'd seen before. It was shorter, stockier, almost human. But its skin was burned and peeling, like it had been through a fire. And its head was twisted at an impossible angle, hanging limply to one side. I recognized it instantly. It was Eddie. He took a slow step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like something was controlling him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a horrible, wet, gurgling noise. I stumbled back, tripping over the curb. When I looked up again, Eddie was gone, but the figures had returned. They surrounded the parking lot, their glowing skin shimmering faintly in the dark. I could feel them watching me, their faceless heads tilting in unison. Then, all at once, they began to move. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty and desolate. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps impossibly quiet, but in perfect sync. The last thing I remember is the sound of screeching tires, and then Darkness. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the road. My head throbbed, my body aching like I'd been hit by a truck. My phone was lying next to me, its screen cracked, but still glowing faintly. There was a new message. You can't escape. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the message on my phone. You can't escape. My body ached, my head throbbed, and the cold asphalt pressed against my skin like it was trying to pull me into the earth. I wanted to get up, but I couldn't. Something deeper than pain kept me there, paralyzing fear. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, swallowed by the night. No cars, no streetlights, just me and the quiet, suffocating dark. And then the phone buzzed again. The message didn't show immediately. Instead, the screen flickered, static bleeding across the display. When the text finally appeared, my blood ran cold. Look up! My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to obey, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I tilted my head toward the sky. It wasn't empty. The stars were gone, replaced by a massive, spiraling shape that pulsed with faint, sickly light. It stretched across the heavens like a wound in reality, a swirling vortex of shadow and energy that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. And within it, I could see them, not the humanoid things from before, something else, shapes too massive to comprehend, twisting and writhing like living smoke. They had no form, no structure, yet I could feel their presence, their weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. The vortex pulsed, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, a mix of grinding metal and tortured screams. The phone buzzed again, dragging my attention back to the screen. It's time to go. Before I could process the message, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the dark. A car. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. Stumbling toward the approaching vehicle, I waved my arms, shouting as loud as I could. Stop! Please, stop! The car slowed, its engine rumbling as it pulled to a stop a few feet away. The driver's window rolled down, and a woman leaned out, her face lit by the soft glow of the dashboard. She looked normal. Tired, maybe, but normal. You okay? She asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I need help, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Please, just get me out of here. She nodded, unlocking the passenger door. Get in. The moment I climbed inside, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd finally escaped whatever nightmare had been hunting me. The woman didn't say much, just kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. I glanced at her, trying to read her expression. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her movements were stiff, robotic, and her face was too calm, too neutral, like she was wearing a mask. Where are you headed? She asked, her voice flat. Anywhere but here, I said. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the road. That's the right answer. As we drove, the landscape outside grew darker, the shadows stretching longer and deeper. The road began to twist and curve in unnatural ways, leading us through a landscape that didn't feel real. What is this place? I asked, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. I turned to look at her again, and my stomach dropped. Her face wasn't a face anymore. It was smooth, featureless, just like the things from the stream. I scrambled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked, trapping me inside. You looked away, she said, her voice no longer human. It was layered now, a sickening mix of tones that echoed in my head. You were warned. The car began to shake violently, the engine roaring like a living thing. The world outside the windows blurred, the darkness bleeding into itself, until it was impossible to tell where the road ended and the sky began. I screamed, pounding on the window, the door, anything that might let me out. But the car kept moving, faster and faster, until the shapes outside began to take form. Figures, hundreds of them, maybe thousands lining the edges of the road. They were all watching, the translucent skin glowing faintly in the dark. As we passed, they tilted their heads in perfect unison, their faceless gazes locked on me. The vortex in the sky grew larger, closer, its pulsating light flooding the car with an unnatural glow. You don't understand yet, the woman, or whatever she was, said. But you will. The car veered off the road, plunging into the void. I don't know how long I fell. The darkness was infinite, crushing, and the only sound was my own panicked breathing. And then, without warning, I hit the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I was alive. Somehow. I opened my eyes and my stomach turned. I was back in the rocket. The cockpit was the same as before, cold, sterile, and horribly empty. Except now, the seats were filled. They weren't human. The humanoid things sat perfectly still, their heads tilted toward me. In their hands, they held those strange objects again. Cylinders, shards of glass, twisted metal. But now, I understood what they were. They were remnants, pieces of something or someone from before. My gaze fell on the seat nearest to me, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't empty. It held me, or at least what was left of me. My own burned, mutilated body sat slumped in the chair, its head twisted at an impossible angle. The eyes were wide open, staring back at me with an expression of pure terror. The cockpit door slid open, and the figures stood in unison. They moved toward me, their long, spindly limbs reaching out. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. As their hands closed around me, I heard the voice again, layered and inhuman. We are here. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in my car. The parking lot was empty. The diner was gone. The sky was normal again, the stars twinkling softly above. For a moment, I thought it was over, just a nightmare. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I wasn't alone. They were sitting in the back seat, their heads tilted, their faceless gazes locked on me. The last thing I heard before the mirror shattered was the voice echoing in my mind. You can't escape. I was paid $20,000 to deliver a package to a Freemason lodge. Inside were blueprints for a city that doesn't exist yet. All right, let me preface this by saying I'm not a conspiracy nut, and I don't believe half the things I see online about shadow governments or secret societies. I'm a normal dude. I work part-time at a UPS store. I live in a crappy apartment with my best friend, and most of my life revolves around trying to stretch a paycheck far enough to pay rent, keep my Wi-Fi on, and still afford gas station coffee. You get it. So when I came across a Craigslist ad offering $20,000 to deliver a package, I should have known better. But, come on, $20,000 for a single delivery. I mean, it was so sketchy that it was almost hilarious. Almost. I'm gonna be real. If my bank account wasn't hovering at like $48.12, and if my car hadn't started making this awful grinding sound every time I hit the brakes, I probably wouldn't have clicked on it, but I did. The ad was simple. It said, "Wanted, courier for urgent package delivery. No questions asked. $20,000 upon completion. Must have a valid ID and reliable transportation. Discretion is mandatory." No contact name, no company name, just a random Gmail address. It felt like a trap, but when you've got more bills than common sense, you start ignoring red flags. I emailed the guy and got a response within 10 minutes. The reply was just as vague as the ad. "Thank you for responding. If you're serious about the job, meet me at the Starbucks on 5th and Elm at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Bring ID. Payment will be made upon completion." I almost didn't show up. I mean, who answers Craigslist ads anymore without assuming they're gonna get murdered or, at the very least, scammed? But curiosity got the better of me, and the idea of walking away from 20 grand. Yeah, not happening. The meeting. The Starbucks was packed, as usual. You know how it is. College students with laptops, moms with strollers, dudes in suits yelling into their AirPods. I grabbed a seat by the window and ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu. I was half expecting some guy in a trench coat with sunglasses to slide into the chair across from me. But no. Instead, this dude in his mid-40s, wearing a plain blue polo and khakis, walked in, holding one of those reusable Starbucks cups. He looked so normal. He spotted me immediately and waved like we were old friends. When he sat down, he didn't even bother with small talk, just pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the table. "You're here for the delivery job, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "Yeah, I guess so." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Here's the deal. Inside this envelope is the address where you'll be delivering the package. Once you agree, there's no backing out. Are you comfortable with that?" Not really," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "What's in the package? Drugs? Body parts?" His expression didn't change. I said no questions, remember? The way he said it gave me chills, but I figured this was probably just some rich guy trying to move something shady without getting his hands dirty. Maybe a black market watch or a stolen piece of art. I don't know. The point is, it didn't feel dangerous. Yet. I gave him my ID, and he wrote something down on a piece of paper. Then he slid the envelope across the table. "You'll receive further instructions when you get there. Make sure no one follows you." Before I could ask what he meant, he stood up and left. Just like that. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to decide if I should just walk away. But when I opened the envelope and saw a check for $5,000 as an advance, I decided I'd see this thing through. The package. The address led me to a small warehouse on the outskirts of town, one of those places that looks like it hasn't been used for anything legit in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling off the walls. When I knocked on the door, a guy with a thick Eastern European accent opened it and handed me a plain black box. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it was heavier than it looked. "Drive carefully," he said, his tone dead serious. "And whatever you do, do not open it." I swear I almost laughed. Like, dude, this is literally the plot of every bad horror movie ever. But he didn't look like he was joking. And honestly, that $20,000 was starting to feel more like hazard pay than a payday. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something weird. There was a guy sitting in a beat-up red Honda across the street, smoking a cigarette and watching me. I couldn't see his face, but he definitely wasn't trying to be subtle. I got in my car and took the long way home, making random turns and even pulling into a McDonald's drive-thru just to see if he'd follow me. He didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The lodge. The address on the envelope wasn't in town. It was a 3-hour drive into the middle of nowhere, and by the time I got there, the sun was already setting. The place looked like something out of a history book, a massive stone building with columns in the front, and a giant compass and square emblem carved into the wall above the door. A Freemason lodge. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know much about Freemasons, but I've heard enough to know they're supposed to be some kind of secret society, like the kind of place where rich old dudes in robes sit around making deals and plotting world domination. I don't know if any of that's true, but standing in front of the lodge, it definitely felt off. I knocked on the door, and this older guy, probably in his 70s, opened it. He didn't say a word, just nodded and held out his hand. I gave him the box, and he disappeared inside without another word. I thought that was it. Job done. But as I turned to leave, another man stepped out of the shadows. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, and he was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. "You're not done yet," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Follow me." At this point, my gut was screaming at me to leave, but before I could argue, he handed me another envelope. "Open it," he said. Inside were blueprints. They looked like they were for a city. Massive skyscrapers, intricate subway systems, parks, and streets, all labeled with numbers instead of names. But here's the thing. I googled some of the landmarks on the map later, and none of them exist. I mean, the streets weren't on Google Maps. The buildings didn't match anything I could find, and even the geographic layout didn't look like anywhere on Earth. "Where is this?" I asked, holding up the blueprints. The man smiled, but there was something wrong with it, like his face didn't quite know how to make the expression. "That's not your concern," he said. Then he handed me another black box, even heavier than the first one, and told me to take it back to the warehouse, where I'd picked up the first package. And that's where I'm gonna stop for now. I know this sounds crazy, but I swear to you, this is exactly what happened. If you guys want me to keep going, let me know. But honestly, just writing this out is making me feel like someone's watching me again. I'll update soon. Probably. When I got back to my car with the second box, something felt heavier. Not just the box itself, but the air around me, like I had just stepped into a different reality. The whole time I was walking back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. You know that prickling sensation you get on the back of your neck, like when you're alone in a dark room, but you feel like you're not really alone? Yeah, it was like that. The lodge was eerily quiet behind me, just this massive stone building silhouetted against the dying light of the sunset. No birds, no wind, no sound at all, except for the crunch of gravel under my boots. The box felt even heavier now, like it was straining my arms, but I didn't dare stop to set it down. I just wanted to get out of there. When I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I finally exhaled. My car isn't much to look at. An old Honda Civic held together with duct tape and hope, but it suddenly felt like the safest place in the world. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. But as my headlights flicked on, I saw it. The guy from the red Honda earlier. He was standing just at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, half hidden in the shadows. His face was turned toward me, but I couldn't make out any details. just the faint glow of his cigarette and the shine of his eyes reflecting the light. My stomach twisted. How the hell had he gotten here before me? I'd taken so many random turns earlier that it was impossible he could have followed me, let alone gotten ahead. Unless he knew where I was going all along. I didn't wait to find out. I threw the car into reverse, did a quick 3-point turn, and floored it back toward the highway. The warehouse. Again, the drive back to the warehouse was brutal. The box sat in the passenger seat, silent but somehow ominous, like it was aware. I know that sounds insane, but every time I glanced at it, I felt this low-grade nausea creep up my throat, like the air around it was wrong. About halfway there, my GPS started glitching. The little blue arrow froze for a second, then started spinning wildly. I pulled over to try and reset it, and that's when I noticed something. There were fingerprints on the inside of my windshield. I swear on my life, they weren't there before. They were smudged, like someone had pressed their hands flat against the glass and dragged them downward. My stomach dropped. I checked the locks again, even though I hadn't stopped anywhere long enough for anyone to climb inside. The car was empty. I didn't wait for the GPS to fix itself. I just kept driving. When I finally pulled up to the warehouse, the place looked different. It was still the same run-down building, but something was off. The boards covering the windows were gone, and I could see faint light flickering inside, like candlelight. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood. I parked a little farther away this time, just in case I needed to make a quick getaway. When I stepped out of the car, I noticed my footprints from earlier were still in the dirt, but there were new ones too. Bigger, heavier, leading up to the door and back again, like someone or something had been pacing. The guy with the Eastern European accent answered the door again, but he wasn't alone this time. There was another man standing behind him, tall, pale, and bald, with eyes so deep set they looked like they belonged to a skull. He didn't say anything, just stared at me like he was measuring me, calculating. I handed over the box without a word, but before I could leave, the bald guy stepped forward. He leaned in close, too close, and sniffed me. "I smell fear," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like someone dragging a blade across stone. "Good. Fear keeps you alive." I didn't wait to hear anything else. I turned and practically sprinted back to my car. The night visitor. That night, I couldn't sleep. My roommate, Jake, was out of town, so the apartment was dead silent, except for the occasional creak of the old pipes. I locked every door and window, but it didn't help. I kept checking them anyway, over and over, like I was expecting someone to be standing on the other side. At around 2 a.m., I started hearing this faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the pipes, but then I realized it was too rhythmic. Tap, 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 like someone gently knocking on glass. It was coming from my bedroom window. I live on the 3rd floor. I froze. My body went cold, and I swear I could feel my heart stop for a second. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake. I don't know how I worked up the nerve to look, but I did. I pulled back the curtain just an inch, and there he was, the guy from the red Honda. He was standing on the fire escape, staring directly at me. His face was pale and expressionless, but his eyes were wrong. They were too wide, the whites almost glowing in the dim light, and his pupils were tiny pinpricks, like he'd been staring at the sun for hours. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring, like he was waiting for something. I don't remember grabbing my phone, but the next thing I knew, I was dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. When the operator answered, I tried to explain what was happening, but my words were coming out in a panicked jumble. "Someone's outside my window," I managed to choke out. "What's your address?" the operator asked. I gave it to her, and she paused. "Sir, are you sure about that? Our records show that building burned down 2 years ago." I dropped the phone. When I looked back at the window, he was gone. The blueprint city. The next morning, I decided to look at the blueprints again. Something about them had been bothering me since I first saw them, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to whatever was happening. I spread them out on the kitchen table and started going over every detail. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were tiny symbols etched into the corners of the pages, symbols that looked like a mix of ancient runes and something else. They weren't just decorative, though. They formed a pattern leading from one part of the map to another. At the very center of the city was a building labeled Eterna Nexus. I googled the phrase, and nothing came up. Nothing. No results at all, which is practically impossible in this day and age. It was like the words didn't exist. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do not dig any deeper. You are being watched." And then, as I stared at the message, a shadow passed by my window. I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't sleep the night after the text. I didn't even try. Every little noise felt amplified in the silence of my apartment. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the walls, even the faint buzzing from the streetlights outside. Every shadow in the corners of the room felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to turn my back. I sat at my kitchen table with the blueprints spread out in front of me. The name Eterna Nexus was burned into my brain now, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to figure out what it was. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was the kind of stupidity that gets people killed in every horror movie ever made. The symbols in the corners of the blueprints wouldn't stop staring back at me. They looked ancient, but they weren't just random designs. They were deliberate, almost mathematical. They formed lines that crisscrossed through the map, all leading to the center where Eterna Nexus was marked. The problem was, there was no actual location. Nothing matched up with any real-world maps. I even went down a rabbit hole on conspiracy forums, thinking maybe I could find someone who'd seen something similar. All I found were dead ends. It was like this place wasn't supposed to exist, but somehow, the people who gave me the package knew it did. And that's when my phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number as before. "You've been warned." The message wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, as if to confirm I wasn't just imagining things, the power went out. The hum of the fridge, the streetlights outside, the glow of my laptop, everything went dead in an instant. The entire apartment plunged into darkness. I scrambled to grab my phone, using the screen's faint light to navigate the room. As I moved toward the window, trying to see if the whole street was out, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A single, deliberate knock at my front door. The intruder. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Slow, measured. Knock, knock. It wasn't just someone knocking. They were waiting between each knock, like they wanted me to feel every second of silence in between. I didn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate. Then, whoever it was, spoke. "Open the door." The voice was deep and calm, but it had this strange, unnatural quality to it, like someone trying to imitate a human voice, but not quite getting it right. "I know you're in there," the voice continued. "You've seen too much. Open the door, or I'll come in." The way they said it, "I'll come in," wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I don't know what possessed me to move, but I finally managed to grab a knife from the kitchen counter. I crept toward the door as quietly as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. When I peeked through the peephole, there was no one there, just the empty hallway. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Something was wrong. The hallway wasn't empty. Not really. The shadows near the far end were moving, shifting and writhing, like they were alive. And then the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window. I live on the 3rd floor. The masked man. I turned slowly, knife still clenched in my hand. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the outline of someone standing on the other side of the glass. They were tall, taller than anyone I'd ever seen, and their head was tilted slightly to the side, like they were studying me through the fabric. Then, as if sensing I was looking at them, they raised a hand and began tapping on the glass. Not knocking, tapping, tap, tap, tap. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the tapping stopped. The silhouette didn't move, though. It just stood there, waiting. I was about to make a run for the door when I heard the faintest sound, like fabric rustling. I turned just in time to see a small envelope slide under the crack of the door. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The envelope was black, just like the packages I'd delivered. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't really have a choice. With shaking hands, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken just minutes earlier, sitting at the kitchen table with the blueprints, and written on the back in shaky handwriting were 2 words, Eterna Nexus. Before I could process what was happening, the power came back on. The lights flickered once, twice, and then stayed on. When I looked back at the window, the silhouette was gone. The blueprints secret. After that night, I decided I needed to get rid of the blueprints. I don't know what kind of game I'd been pulled into, but I wanted no part of it anymore. I stuffed them into a backpack and drove out to an old quarry about an hour outside of town. It's one of those places people use as a dumping ground for junk, broken furniture, tires, that kind of thing. When I got there, I climbed to the edge of the quarry and looked down at the water below. The blueprints felt heavy in my hands, almost like they didn't want to be destroyed. But before I could toss them in, I saw something in the water. It was a reflection. At first, I thought it was just my own face, but then I realized it wasn't. The reflection was staring back at me, but the eyes weren't mine. They were black, completely black, like the void, and the face was smiling. I stumbled back, dropping the blueprints. The papers spilled out onto the ground, and that's when I saw it. There was a new detail on the map. A tiny red X had appeared right in the center where Eterna Nexus was marked. I swear it hadn't been there before. And beneath it, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "Come home." The invitation. I don't know what's happening to me, but I can't ignore it anymore. The people, or things, behind this aren't going to let me walk away. The nightmare started that same night. Dreams of a city that shouldn't exist. Towering skyscrapers that seemed to stretch into infinity. Streets filled with faceless people, all whispering the same thing over and over. Eterna Nexus. Eterna Nexus. I don't know what's waiting for me at that red X, but I'm starting to think I don't have a choice. If I don't go to them, they're going to come to me. I should have left town. I should have burned the blueprints, ditched my car, changed my name, and disappeared. But it didn't matter. Deep down, I knew that running wouldn't save me. Whatever this thing was, this Eterna Nexus, it wasn't just something you could outrun. It was already inside my head. The dreams were getting worse. Every night, I'd find myself standing in the middle of that impossible city, surrounded by towering skyscrapers that seemed to breathe, their glassy surfaces pulsating like the walls of a living organism. The faceless people were always there, walking the streets in slow, synchronized steps, their heads jerking in unnatural angles as they whispered, "Come home." And every morning, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me like a straitjacket. But last night was different. The dream didn't end when I woke up. I opened my eyes at 3:33 a.m. I remember because the red glow of my alarm clock was burned into my retinas, and the whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the corner of my room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I wasn't fully awake, but then I saw something move. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a figure, hunched over, its body too long, too thin, its joints bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its head twitched toward me, and though I couldn't see its face in the darkness, I felt its eyes on me. "Come home," it whispered, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. Male, female, child, old, all speaking in unison. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, locked in place by some unseen force. The figure crept closer, the sound of its bones cracking echoing in the stillness. Its breath smelled like rotting meat and copper, and its fingers, long and skeletal, reached out inches from my face. Then, just as its touch was about to graze my skin, I woke up. For real, this time. But here's the thing. The whispering was still there. The mark. When I stumbled into the bathroom to splash cold water on my face, I noticed something in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a bruise, but as I leaned closer, I realized it was a symbol burned into the skin just below my collarbone. One of the same symbols from the blueprints. It wasn't a tattoo. It wasn't something I could wash off. The edges were raw and red, like it had been branded into my flesh while I slept. I wanted to scream, to cry, to claw it off my skin, but there was no point. I was marked now. They owned me. The coordinates, the red X on the blueprints, had been haunting me since the quarry. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I tried to ignore it, my phone would buzz with another text from that unknown number. Go to the X. Time is running out. You belong to us. It didn't matter if I blocked the number or turned my phone off. The messages still came through. They always came through. By the time the fourth message arrived, "We're already here," I realized I couldn't avoid it anymore. I didn't have to figure out where the red X was. I woke up to my phone's GPS, already programmed with coordinates, the map glowing ominously on my screen. The location wasn't anywhere near civilization. It was in the middle of a dense forest, about 5 hours away, a place I didn't even know existed. There were no roads leading to it, no trails marked on Google Maps. just a blank patch of green in the middle of nowhere. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like an order. The forest I left before sunrise. The drive was surreal, like the world around me was subtly wrong. The highway seemed longer than it should have been, the mile markers flickering in and out of existence as I passed them. At one point, I swear I drove past the same gas station 3 times, even though I hadn't made any turns. And then there were the animals, deer, raccoons, even stray dogs, standing perfectly still at the edge of the road, their heads turned toward me as I passed. Their eyes weren't normal. They were too wide, too human, and they followed me, unblinking, until I disappeared from their sight. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. The GPS said I had to continue on foot, so I parked my car on the side of a dirt road and started walking. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Just silence. I don't know how long I walked. Time didn't feel real anymore. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even though it was still morning. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then I saw it. Eterna Nexus. It wasn't a city. Not really. At the center of the forest was a clearing, and in that clearing was a structure, a massive black pyramid that seemed to absorb the light around it. The air was heavier here, thick with the smell of decay and ozone. The pyramid wasn't on the blueprints, but I knew this was the place. The red X. As I approached, I noticed symbols carved into the base of the structure. The same ones from the blueprints, the same one burned into my skin. The entrance was a gaping hole at the base of the pyramid, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I should have turned back. I should have run. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me inside. The descent, the interior, was pitch black, but as I stepped deeper into the pyramid, faint blue lights flickered to life along the walls, illuminating a spiral staircase that seemed to descend forever. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls began to pulse faintly, like they were alive. As I reached the bottom, the staircase opened into a massive chamber, and that's when I saw them, the faceless people from my dreams. They were standing in a perfect circle, their bodies unnaturally still, their heads twitching violently. And in the center of the circle was an altar made of black stone, slick with something that looked disturbingly like blood. On the altar was the black box I'd delivered. The tallest figure in the circle turned to face me. It didn't have eyes, just smooth skin stretched over where its face should have been, but I could feel it staring into me, reading every thought, every fear. "You've come home," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. The rest of the figures began to chant, their voices rising in a maddening crescendo. Eterna Nexus. Eterna Nexus. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The tallest figure reached out, its hand impossibly long, and touched the brand on my chest. Pain exploded through my body, and I collapsed to my knees. As my vision blurred, I saw the black box on the altar begin to open, and inside was me. A perfect copy of me, staring back with lifeless black eyes and a twisted smile. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of my own voice, laughing, but it wasn't coming from me. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time doesn't work the same way in that place. When I came to, I wasn't in the pyramid anymore. I was in my apartment. At first, I thought it had all been a dream, some elaborate nightmare that my mind had cooked up. But then I noticed the details. The brand on my chest was still there, raw and burning. My shoes were caked in dirt from the forest, and my phone, sitting on the kitchen table, was shattered, like someone had smashed it against the wall. I wanted to believe I was safe. I wanted to believe it was over. But when I walked into the bathroom to splash water on my face, I saw something that made my knees buckle. The mirror wasn't reflecting me. I don't mean it was blank or broken. It was showing something else. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The thing in the mirror was grinning, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide. Its teeth were jagged, and its eyes, God, its eyes were pitch black, like bottomless pits. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, and then it spoke. "Do you see now?" it asked, its voice dripping with mockery. "Do you understand what you are?" I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt like it was closing up, like something was gripping it from the inside. "You've been chosen," it continued, tilting its head. "Eterna Nexus isn't just a place. It's a threshold, a doorway between worlds. And now, you're part of it." I stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me, but the words kept echoing in my mind. "You're part of it." The people outside. I thought I could run. I thought maybe, if I got far enough away, I could escape whatever this was. I grabbed what little cash I had, a duffel bag with some clothes, and the keys to my car. As I walked out the door, I noticed something strange. The hallway of my building was completely empty. Now, I live in a crappy, overpopulated apartment complex where you can hear your neighbors fighting through the walls at all hours of the day. There's always someone coming or going, the smell of burnt toast or cigarette smoke wafting in the air. But now, nothing. No sounds, no smells, just silence. I made it to the parking lot, but as I opened the door to my car, I froze. Every single window in the complex had someone standing in it. Men, women, children, every single apartment. They were all just standing there, staring down at me. Their faces were blank, their expressions completely empty. At first, I thought they were normal people, just neighbors curious about the commotion. But then I noticed the eyes, black, every single one of them. I slammed the car door shut and peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get the hell out of there. The highway that never ends. I drove for hours, maybe longer. The sun set behind me, and the world was swallowed by darkness. My GPS was dead, my phone wouldn't turn on, and the radio only played static. The highway stretched on forever. No turns, no exits, no landmarks. Just the same stretch of cracked asphalt disappearing into the void. I started to notice things on the side of the road. At first, it was small, just shapes in the shadows. A figure here, a flicker of movement there. But then they started getting closer. The first one I saw clearly was a woman. She was standing in the middle of the road, her head cocked at an impossible angle, her mouth hanging open like her jaw had been unhinged. I swerved to avoid her, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. The second one was a man. He was crouched by the side of the road, his body twisted and contorted, his fingers digging into the dirt like claws. I kept driving, faster and faster, but no matter how far I went, the figures kept appearing. Dozens of them, hundreds. They lined the sides of the highway, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then, Without warning, my headlights flickered and went out. The black box. When the car finally broke down, I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The figures had stopped moving. They were all just standing there now, surrounding the car, watching me. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy. And then I saw it. The black box. It was sitting in the passenger seat, even though I was sure I left it at the pyramid. The sight of it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. The lid was slightly open now, and something inside was moving. A voice echoed in my head, deep, guttural, and inhuman. "Open it!" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Open it, or we'll open you." My hands moved on their own. I didn't want to touch the box, but it didn't matter. My fingers pried the lid open, and what I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was my own face, not a reflection, my actual face, flesh and bone, perfectly intact, staring up at me with those same lifeless black eyes, the mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, wider than should have been possible. And then it started laughing. Not just a normal laugh. It was my laugh, warped and distorted, overlapping on itself like a broken recording. The final truth. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the car door opening. When I woke up, I wasn't in the car anymore. I was standing in the middle of the city from the blueprints. The streets were empty, the buildings looming above me like silent monoliths. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the sky was a swirling mass of black and red. I turned around, and there it was, the pyramid. At its base stood the faceless figure from before, its head tilted in that same unnatural way. It raised one long skeletal hand and pointed at me. "You're home now," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. The city began to move then, the buildings shifting and twisting, the ground beneath me buckling like it was alive. The faceless people emerged from the shadows, their heads jerking violently as they whispered in unison, "Eterna Nexus, Eterna Nexus." And that's when I understood. I wasn't me anymore. I was it. I was part of the city now, another piece of the puzzle, a cog in the machine. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own doppelganger, standing at the edge of the crowd, smiling that impossible smile. And then I was gone. Eterna Nexus awaits you.